The execution of Anne Boleyn has long been attributed by many historians to Thomas Cromwell. As Tracy Borman aptly puts it, although he can be exonerated of many other crimes, this is one that I believe should still rest at his door. This interpretation, however, is not without controversy. The enduring fascination with the relationship between Cromwell and Boleyn goes far beyond this single accusation. Henry VIII's second wife and his first minister were undeniably rivals, yet they had no reason to be. On matters of the Reformation, they were ostensibly allies. Linda M. Hart aptly described their relationship as the ultimate frenemy. The ambiguity of this phrase requires no clarification, as it applies fittingly to both figures. What caused the minister and the Queen to turn from allies to adversaries? When did their relationship reach the point of no return? One thing is clear: neither emerged victorious. While Cromwell succeeded in orchestrating Anne's downfall, he ultimately fell victim to the same brutal political machinery that had claimed her life. Those who hold him accountable for Anne's fate might consider his demise poetic justice. Cromwell's execution was far more barbaric than the Queen's. Adding to this narrative is the intriguing story of a portrait of Cromwell housed at Hever Castle, a detail that showcases the dark, sardonic edge of English humor. It is a reminder of how history continues to intertwine the legacies of these two formidable figures. Before the sword and the axe take center stage, we must first examine the prelude to the conflict. The seeds of escalation were sown during the days of Cromwell and Anne's apparent friendship. Anne first came to know and value Cromwell as Thomas Wolsey's trusted aide. By the late 1520s, she was already writing letters to the astute lawyer. When Wolsey failed to secure Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Cromwell took up the challenge. He recognized the opportunity to sever England's ties with Rome and advance the Reformation. The reform-minded Boleyns backed this approach. For a time, their collaboration flourished. Cromwell sourced Protestant books for Anne from the continent, works banned in England. Anne shared these books with the king, who was captivated both by her and the ideas she presented. Henry's determination to divorce Catherine grew stronger, even if it required a decisive break with the Pope. As Anne's influence rose, so did her family's fortunes. She revealed to Henry that Cromwell was her supplier of the controversial literature, and the king rewarded Cromwell accordingly. By 1530, Cromwell had joined the Privy Council, and by late 1532, he had become Henry's leading minister. Yet their alliance was, as Tracy Borman aptly put it, an alliance of convenience more than ideology. Their shared convictions were not enough to bind their destinies irrevocably. Anne, however, made a crucial miscalculation, one that continues to be echoed in historical interpretations. Anne saw herself as Cromwell's patroness, a view shared by her brother George and her father Thomas. This notion was rooted in Renaissance culture, which highly valued such hierarchical relationships. Cromwell, familiar with these conventions, appeared to play along. But as Linda M. Hart noted, Cromwell was the ultimate Renaissance man, and he did not see Anne as his patroness. For him, the king was his sole benefactor. Cromwell supported Anne and her family because it aligned with the king's wishes. He advanced the Reformation when it suited his own ambitions. At no point did he view himself as subordinate to the Queen. The moment the king demanded action against the Boleyns, or if they obstructed his own objectives, Cromwell was prepared to act against them. Both Cromwell and the Boleyns came from unremarkable backgrounds, making their ascension to court all the more extraordinary. I have previously explored the humble origins of Henry's chief minister in another video, which I recommend. The Boleyns had risen in the 15th century through the wool trade. Both sides understood the arduous journey to power and the ruthless strategies required to maintain it. That Cromwell had climbed from obscurity and survived the downfall of his former master, Wolsey, should have served as a stark warning to the Boleyns. Three main reasons are often cited for the cooling of relations between Cromwell and Queen Anne over time. First, their political beliefs diverged significantly in practice. Cromwell was a far more radical reformer than Anne. Her vision aligned more closely with Henry VIII's idea of a Catholic Church under his own authority, coupled with an English-language Bible. One major point of contention was the dissolution of the monasteries. While Henry supported this initiative primarily for the immense wealth it promised to bring to the crown, Anne opposed it. She recognized that monasteries provided essential social services, including welfare for the poor and education. Anne argued that at least part of the proceeds should be reinvested in these areas to avoid creating political problems. Henry and Cromwell disagreed, insisting that all the funds should flow directly into royal coffers. It remains uncertain whether the Boleyns sought financial gain from these funds, as suggested by historical fiction such as the Tudors. The notion is somewhat plausible, given their reputation for high-handed behavior. Anne, in particular, was known for her volatile temper, which contrasted sharply with the controlled demeanor of her predecessor, Catherine of Aragon. Henry's dissatisfaction with Anne's behavior became evident when he demanded that she act as her betters had done. Cromwell noted this carefully. Although Anne's financial motives cannot be proven, the significance of money in their conflicts should not be overlooked. Anne's demands for moral and practical use of the funds clashed with Henry and Cromwell's priorities. Politically, Anne also had a strong case, warning that neglecting the poor would create long-term problems for the crown. However, the king and his minister ultimately prioritized their own interests, a choice Anne made abundantly clear to them. The second source of tension was foreign policy. Anne championed an alliance with France, a country she held in high regard due to the formative years she spent there. Cromwell, by contrast, favored an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor. However, during a private audience with the king, Henry's poor mood led him to demand that any offers from the emperor be in writing and accompanied by apologies for past breaches of trust. The king reprimanded him for even suggesting such an alliance. Intriguingly, Cromwell failed, or perhaps chose not, to relay a critical piece of information. Emperor Charles had hinted at a willingness to accept Anne's marriage to Henry under certain conditions. For the time being, it suited Cromwell that Henry remained unaware. By then, he had come to see Anne's significant involvement in every area of politics as a growing obstacle. This brings us to the third point. Anne and Cromwell began competing for the king's favor. Their rivalry frequently resulted in public disputes. Anne's infamous declaration during one argument that she wanted Cromwell's head separated from his shoulders has become legendary. Cromwell, however, appeared unshaken. According to Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, when asked about the danger, Cromwell replied confidently, "I trust so much on my master Henry that I fancy she, Anne, cannot do me any harm." Finally, a fourth factor entered the equation, one directly tied to the king. On January 29, 1536, Anne suffered a devastating miscarriage, possibly of a male child. Henry interpreted this as a sign of divine disfavor, reportedly saying that God did not want him to have a male heir with Anne. His faith in her was shattered. By this time, his attention had shifted to Jane Seymour, who refused to become his mistress and insisted on marriage. Cromwell, having once helped Henry rid himself of an unwanted wife, was called upon to perform the same task again. On April 1, 1536, Chapuis wrote to Charles V, "I have heard that this king's mistress and Secretary Cromwell were on bad terms just now." Rumours swirled about Cromwell's involvement in arranging a new marriage for Henry. The stage was set for escalation. Anne launched her final battle against Cromwell with a calculated move. She instructed her chaplain, John Skip, to deliver a provocative sermon. Skip warned that a king must possess wisdom and resist the influence of wicked advisers who might urge him toward shameful deeds. The sermon referenced Haman, a notorious villain from the Old Testament who, as the enemy of Queen Esther, sought to confiscate the Jews' wealth for the royal treasury. When Esther opposed him, Haman plotted the execution of her protector Mordecai, only to meet his own end on the gallows he had built for Mordecai. The parallel was unmistakable, a direct threat to Cromwell. But Anne aimed not only to intimidate, she sought to reshape Henry VIII's narrative of blame. The king believed her responsible for his failure to produce a male heir. Through Skip's sermon, Anne attempted to redirect this frustration, casting Cromwell as the evil advisor responsible for their troubles. Her intentions were made abundantly clear. Cromwell understood the danger and moved swiftly. As historian Sandra Vasoli observed, he wanted her out of the picture. It is pretty well acknowledged that Cromwell devised a plan that would set Henry over the edge. Cromwell executed a multi-pronged strategy to ensure Anne's downfall. First, he aligned himself more closely with the conservative faction at court, including Sir Nicholas Carew and the Seymour family, who had long been at odds with Anne and supported Jane Seymour. Second, after April 21st, he briefly disappeared from court following a tense exchange with Henry over the Imperial Alliance proposal. Though this seemed like a retreat, Cromwell was preparing his next move. Third, he began gathering the damning evidence necessary for an irrefutable case against Anne. Ironically, Anne's own behavior offered him the material he needed. Anne was known for her playful, flirtatious nature, which extended to nearly all the men in her circle. Her close relationship with her brother George, though entirely innocent, was another aspect of her character that was ripe for exploitation. Cromwell seized on this, knowing he needed accusations that Henry would find both credible and enraging. Henry later described Anne's influence as witchcraft, implying she had wielded a shameful power over men. This narrative suited both Henry and Cromwell, reinforcing the perception of Anne's guilt. Moreover, many of the men in Anne's circle were Cromwell's political adversaries, allowing him to orchestrate a purge of his rivals alongside the Queen's destruction. Cromwell's accusations included the shocking claim that Anne had engaged in incest with her brother. The more scandalous the charges, the more inclined Henry was to believe them. The aim was to construct a narrative so compelling it would sway the king. Cromwell manipulated the proceedings to ensure Anne's conviction. He packed the court with her political opponents, leaving her with no chance, despite her eloquent and courageous defense. The outcome was predetermined: a death sentence. Cromwell further isolated Anne during her imprisonment in the Tower. The ladies assigned to attend her were unsympathetic and acted as spies for Cromwell. A letter dated May 6, 1536, believed to be Anne's final plea to Henry, was later found among Cromwell's belongings. It remains unclear whether the letter is authentic, but if it was, only Cromwell, Anne's one-time ally, ever read her words. On May 19, 1536, Anne met her fate. After a one-day delay, a French executioner severed her head with a single stroke of his sword. By then, her marriage to Henry had been annulled. The men convicted alongside her had been executed days earlier, though claims that Anne witnessed their deaths from her chambers have since been debunked. Anne faced her execution with remarkable composure. She appeared to have overcome the panic attacks she suffered after her sentencing, at least outwardly. When told her executioner would use a sword, a sign of her status, she reportedly laughed with dark humor, saying, "I have a little neck. This is good." The question of responsibility for Anne Boleyn's demise remains a focal point for historians, though there is broad consensus that the accusations against her were baseless. Few works from the 19th or 20th centuries seriously entertain the notion of her guilt. When assigning blame, two main schools of thought emerge, represented by Tracy Borman and David Starkey. Borman attributes Anne's fall to Thomas Cromwell, while Starkey places the ultimate responsibility on Henry VIII. Borman contends that Anne had become too dangerous for Cromwell to allow her to survive. She had repeatedly managed to regain Henry's favor, and if she succeeded again, her wishes might come to fruition. In that scenario, it could very well be Cromwell's head on the chopping block instead of hers. Conversely, Starkey argues that Henry was the driving force behind Anne's downfall. According to Starkey, Henry wanted to end his marriage to Anne and marry Jane Seymour, and Cromwell merely carried out his sovereign's orders. This view aligns with Eustace Chapway's April 1, 1536, observation that the king intended to remarry and had tasked Cromwell with making it happen. However, the debate over responsibility may miss a crucial nuance. It is possible that both Cromwell and Henry agreed on Anne's removal, but disagreed on her ultimate fate. Sandra Vasoli, who has conducted extensive research on Anne's possible letter from the Tower, suggests that Cromwell might not have insisted on Anne's execution. If this interpretation holds, it would imply that Henry was the one who pushed for her death. On the other hand, Borman's argument that Anne was too dangerous to be left alive challenges this notion, as Cromwell likely viewed her continued existence as a significant threat. In my view, the question of whether Cromwell was the central figure in Anne's downfall is ultimately secondary. Henry VIII could have halted the process at any time had he wished to. Anne was not just his queen, but also the mother of his daughter. That he chose not to intervene places the final responsibility squarely on him. While Cromwell may have welcomed and facilitated Anne's downfall, it was Henry who made the definitive decision, making him fundamentally accountable. The blame for Anne Boleyn's demise cannot rest solely with Cromwell. It also lies with Henry VIII. Cromwell fabricated charges against Anne, but only because he knew the king wanted to believe them. Whether or not, Henry harbored doubts about their validity deep down. This should have served as a warning to Cromwell. Henry was clearly willing to employ extreme measures to rid himself of those who displeased him. A flimsy pretext was sufficient justification for execution. This marked a significant difference between Anne's fate and the earlier executions of John Fisher and Thomas More. Cromwell had demonstrated to Henry how the legal system could be manipulated to carry out what amounted to state-sanctioned murder. The king quickly developed a taste for this method. It was inevitable that this approach would eventually turn against Cromwell himself. In 1540, following the disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, Cromwell's time came. He was forced to kneel before the executioner, much like Anne had been. However, Cromwell's end was far more brutal. Unlike Anne, who was granted the swift and expert hand of a French swordsman, Cromwell faced an inexperienced executioner. It took 3 or 4 blows to complete the grim task. This brings us to the present. Anne Boleyn's former home, Hever Castle, recently acquired a portrait of Thomas Cromwell. The castle's staff hesitated over the purchase, given the deadly enmity that had developed between Anne and her adversary. However, Assistant Curator Dr. Owen Emerson explained the reasoning behind the decision. I remembered that before Anne's downfall, she had threatened Cromwell with his life, telling him that she wanted his head off his shoulders. And I then reasoned that since the portrait only shows his head, we were, in a way, fulfilling her wishes. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.